So thank you, everyone, and it's good to be here. This talk is going to be very different to the ones you have listened to on science, but there may be some commonality in the way in which how I approach the strategic development of science with how scientists do their work. So my agenda today is, first of all, I'm going to talk about what I have done and why I'm talking to you today, talk about the world of science that science is in very briefly, and then talk about the UK and why I believe we're able to maintain our position. You heard the ambassador talk about the UK punching above its weight, and I will talk about that and perhaps give my explanation of why we are good at that. I will pause at that stage, perhaps have some discussion if you wish, and then I will talk about what I would suggest this indicates the opportunities for Panama to be. Okay, so who am I? So I spent the first half of my life as an academic mathematician at Cambridge and did that for about 15 to 20 years and ended running a college of Cambridge. And then I moved into the world of medicine and to Imperial College. And I spent the last 10 years of my life being Chief Operating Officer of Imperial College, where I was essentially developing the research strategy and how we invested in research at Imperial. So I'm sure you're aware that the colleges of Imperial and the University of Cambridge are indeed very strong. According to rankings, the Times Higher, Imperial has moved from 13th to 8th, Cambridge from 4th to 2nd, and here the QS rankings. And there are also the subject rankings too. I am not a great believer in rankings. They're really like mixing a recipe, and you can put different things in it and make it taste different. However, there are one thing about rankings which I would say, which is that it is one taster. It gives you a smell of what might be going on. So for example, as soon as I see these rankings and I see that Imperial has actually been dropping in terms of its physical sciences and its engineering and sciences, I say, what are we doing wrong? What is happening? So for me, what I do is build up a picture of life and the way in which science is delivering from all the evidence we can do. After I left Imperial, I became involved in a number of initiatives at a UK government level as to how the UK government should evaluate how efficient and effective we are and how well we invest in our universities. And every 2 years, the government commissions a report called the How Are We Comparing the UK Research Base with Other Countries. And for the last three times, it comes out every 2 years, I have chaired the steering committee for that report. And I will give a reference to it. And for me, it's a very important report. I have a few copies here because it actually indicates how an evidence base can actually influence how one strategy is. So I approach, and what my argument to you today is, adopt some of the principles you use in your science, evidence-based activity. You look and observe and you deduce and you experiment, and then that is how you come to your conclusions. That is how I believe strategies should happen at a government and a university level. But sadly, in my belief, it doesn't happen as often as it should be, and investment and strategies are actually just developed through perhaps influence and power and whim. So, first of all, the global context. We all know that research is becoming more interdisciplinary and more international. We also know as a result that the traditional departmental structures, 30 years ago, every university had its Department of Chemistry, its Department of Physics, and so on. Those don't map necessarily onto the new worlds of science, which are all interdisciplinary discoveries. And of course, we have to ensure that we get academics moving across international boundaries. And I would suggest that certainly in the UK and the European Union, there's increasing use of tools and data to actually evaluate what is happening. So first of all, let me show you this graph, which is looking at the articles and the article share in the world between 2008 and 12. And along the bottom is essentially the share of world articles, and up here is the field-weighted citation index for all the countries which are marked here. And you see here, of course, skewing the graph very dramatically is how China's increase in articles published, their share has increased dramatically. Whereas at the same time, of course, other countries have had to decrease, and the USA has decreased, and other countries also in general have decreased. But if you then look at what the quality, as measured by the field-weighted citation index, has done, of course the quality of China output hasn't actually accelerated at the same rate as its volume. The USA has remained static in its quality. But interesting, some of these countries here, Canada, the UK, Germany, France, Italy, have, without increasing their article share, have increased their quality. That, to me, is very, very important message. What we should be doing is spending money efficiently and ensuring that our quality is coming through. So I would push and say that quality should be the driver always and not quantity. And I'll return to that. So what actually correlates with quality? And I'll talk about quality and how we measure it in the UK in a minute. But there's a very strong correlation, as shown by this graph with the countries on it, between the international co-authorship, so collaboration, international collaboration, and the quality as measured by the field-weighted citation index. So that's a very famous correlation, which is maintained all the time and gets stronger and stronger since this, which is based on 2008 data. So we know that collaboration, international collaboration, is a driving factor for quality. So now let me turn to why I believe the UK is successful in what it does, why it punches above its weight, and so on. We have suffered, like all countries, from static or decreasing budgets. So here is the government grants coming over the last 3 years to education. The dark blue is for teaching, money given to universities for teaching. And we see that that has decreased dramatically at one stage, and that was because the government took the political decision to charge students coming to universities their fees, which they had to pay themselves. But critical was that the UK, and I think the UK ambassador has said this on a couple of occasions, the UK's research investment remained static. It didn't increase with inflation, but it was ring-fenced, as we say. And the government did that partly because of some of the evidence that they were seeing as to what the good was coming out of that research, and partly because of the quality of the research and the impact which universities were able to demonstrate as the result of their research. And that word impact I will come back to. And it is important, I think, when we come and talk about Panama, to recognize that the impact of what you're doing, which may be many years down the road, that at the end of the day should drive what we're doing. Okay, so I showed you here that the research money, some £1.5 billion a year, is given to universities as a result of the research. So how, for research, so how is that divided up amongst the universities? And that's divided up by a process called the research assessment exercise, research excellence framework. And essentially, money is distributed according to the volume, so how many pounds of contract research you're bringing in, and also the quality of it. So it's not just volume, it's quality too, which attracts the money. And there are different ways in which one reimburses a high-cost clinical subject as opposed to an art subject and so on. So essentially what happens is through the research assessment exercise or the research excellence framework, that is how the quality is measured. And it's a process of expert review, after which the money literally flows to the university according to how much successful they are. And very quickly, and I will put these slides on the website later, but each university submits in a series of subject areas, and they're then assessed by sub-panels, as they're called. Sometimes metrics are used. It is an expensive and long project, but the critical thing about it is, as I say here, it is owned and administered. It is owned and administered by the academics themselves. So that is very important, because what you cannot do is impose measurement down on academics. They have to own the process of evaluation, and I would suggest that's always very important. So very quickly you can see that the last research assessment exercise took something like 4 years to actually develop and achieve. So it is a long process and an expensive process. And how the quality is measured is through a number of things. It's measured through outputs, through inputs, through impact, and through the environment. And I won't go into that detail, you can look that up. But 65% of it is measured by the 4 papers which researchers put in. Very importantly, 20% is measured by impact. So that is how we actually put case studies together in each area to suggest why the quality of the work is high. And as a result of that, that is how the money is driven to universities, and therefore that in itself is a driver for academics to achieve quality, not just quantity, as I said before. Now, I talked about the fact and showed you the graph that quality is directly correlated to international collaboration, and how does one promote international collaboration? In the report I've mentioned, there is this graph, which is very hard to read, I know, but you can look at it on the website. It's a very interesting graph because we analyzed the result of academics who move between countries. And so we essentially look at people who are coming in and out of a country, going out and returning, the people who are coming in and then going back, and also people who we call transitory. And the end result of that research, which has now been going for 4 years and is kept up to date, is that if an academic moves to another institute abroad for a period of 1 year or 18 months, then the impact on the quality of that academic's research is relatively small. They are still producing the same kind of quality papers as they were before they went away. But if the academics go away for more than 2 years and stay in a host institution for 2 years and then return, the quality of their papers increases by 20 to 30%. And when that results first came out, people said, well, I guess that's obvious, because what has happened by an academic moving to another country in a host institution and staying for 2 years is formed a really strong collaboration. Staying for 3 months or 6 months is quite nice and whatever, but it's hard to keep up that collaboration. So one of the drivers that's come out of this piece of work is that you can then provide funding patterns which encourage academics to move and stay away and so on. And there are a number of initiatives in the UK which persuade from our research councils and government funding which do exactly that. Now I'm going to pause there and ask if there are any questions people would like to ask on what I said before I then go on and say, well, this is therefore what my view is of what the messages for Panama might be.
Is that a question? I don't really understand much about the Yes, the output part, I don't really understand, like the maximum of 4 papers.
Say again?
The output area of the graph.
Okay, so in the, I think, are you talking about research excellence framework, where in fact what each academic has to do is to submit just 4 papers, their 4 best papers.
Okay.
Some academics will have many, some academics will to choose from and will choose their best, obviously. Some may only have 4. But those 4 papers have to be in a specific period since the last research assessment exercise. You can't keep using them, as it were. Okay. Any other questions people would like to ask? So I think it's for the reasons of using data and analysis, examples of which I've given, but there are many, many, many other ones in here, which can drive the way in which one incentivizes academics. The use of funding to drive collaboration across international boundaries. So the use of ways in which government funding is packaged so that it forces that kind of collaboration, forces that mobility of academics, and so on. All of that is very important, and many of you will be aware of how the European Union sees that as a very strong way in the way in which they allocate their funds to ensure getting that quality. So now let me just turn to my very superficial views of Panama, because I knew nothing about Panama until a few weeks ago in terms of its science and its outputs. But based on what I could trawl, I found some very interesting things. So first of all, let's look at Panama in the world. And you may know these graphs better than I. And I've picked here some of the what I'd call your benchmark countries, but you may not think I've picked them correctly. So the countries I've put on this graph are Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Ecuador, and Panama. And you see Panama down here. This is showing the number of publications over the years. Panama remaining reasonably on this scale static compared to countries like Chile, which have grown enormously in their outputs. If we then flip that and say, well, look at the quality of those outputs. So the same peer group that I mentioned before, and Panama is green as it was in the other one, you can see whereas Chile, whose volume was colossal, its actual quality hasn't actually, as measured by the field-weighted citation index, it hasn't actually grown as fast as one would hope, whereas whereas Panama has been successful in actually at least maintaining and increasing that quality. So for me, looking at the quality of what one's doing, as I said, and not the quantity, is as ever important. So if we now look at the subject areas in which that quality is happening, so this is the areas in which Panama is publishing. So at the top you have agriculture and biological sciences. So here is the number of publications that they've done between 2010 and 2014, and here is the quality of those publications as measured again by the field-weighted citation index. And as you look down here, you can see in terms of the quantity, after the agriculture and biological sciences, we come to medicine, and then we come to biochemistry and molecular biology, environmental sciences, and so on and so forth. But isn't it interesting that the quality of those subject areas doesn't always match the volume of those subject areas? And so you look here and see how the quality of your medicine outputs is very strong. Interestingly, the quality of the multidisciplinary is strong, and there's some strength down here in the arts and humanities. And it would need, if I was looking at this and trying to draw conclusions, I would want to start doing much more digging into why those areas are as they are, in particularly working out what is hidden in that multidisciplinary area and what is therefore driving that quality in the multidisciplinary area. And I don't want you to think that these are true conclusions. Everything needs more analysis. But the first thought that I had when I saw this is, if someone said to me, on the basis of that graph, without doing any more work, where would you be investing? Well, clearly you would be investing in the strong green areas and the light green areas, and you might be saying to yourself, well, what is going on in these other areas, and should we be maintaining our investment? Now, I know there are all sorts of arguments about why one should want to have a holistic university and one in which all subjects are studied and all the rest of it. And that is a strategic decision. Imperial College, as you know, only does science, technology, and medicine. And that's absolutely key to its strategy. And other universities in the UK, driven by the REF, are recognizing they cannot do everything. You have to begin to focus and decide. So maybe a graph or chart like that would make you think about what your strategy as a country should be, and therefore where you should be investing in what institutes and universities. My next slide, which I quickly got, was to actually say, well, where is the collaboration that Panama is doing, and what does it achieve for Panama? So here are all the countries which Panama is collaborating with, and you can see that the size of the bubble is essentially the extent of the collaboration. And very interestingly, if you're looking at what the quality of the collaboration is, so the quality is measured along the bottom here, and what it actually achieves, what it's showing, interestingly, is that the countries which are actually on the face of it, and I say that really strongly, on the face of it, the countries which are providing really strong quality enhancers for Panama are Australia, Italy, Uruguay, and Japan. Now, that needs a lot more analysis before you jump out and stop collaborating with the USA and whatever. But what it would show to me, if I was somehow sitting in the strategic office of Panama, I would be saying, why is this so? What is making up these bubbles? Where is it in one particular discipline where I'm strong and getting value out of Japan in quality value in my collaborations, or is it in another country, and so on? So like all things, just like when you do your scientific experiments, what this is doing is making me ask questions and say, why is it like this? And you dig down and do more detailed analysis to try and interpret what the data is telling you. Here is a picture of collaboration and the way in which countries collaborate. And you can see that the US is at the center of that collaboration. Interestingly, I saw a draft of this web diagram going up to 2014 the other day, and it was very interesting that China had moved more strongly into the center of that web. And so you can see that what they're doing is progressing in their collaboration in order to, collaboration through this global co-authorship, moving gradually into the center in order to increase their quality. And where is Panama? Panama is sitting out there, and I would suggest one of the opportunities you have is to try and move into the center of a web, because as you look at that density of that web, that is where the quality of the countries, highest quality countries are. Now, it's all very well, and all of us say, and I've said it myself to my government, we want more money. How do you expect us to do better unless you give us more money, unless you give us more money? And as I showed you, the UK for the last 3 years has not had an increase in its research budget. But, so that comes to the horrible word which academics don't like, called efficiency. How good are our outputs for the dollars that come in? And this, I think, is a very interesting graph. This shows the efficiency measured in terms of the volume of articles coming out, in terms of the how much is spent on R&D by the country. So essentially it's correlating what the volume of outputs are compared to the volume of money going in. Now that's interesting because what it's showing is that the UK, as measured by this metric, UK, Italy, Canada, are very efficient. They're getting a lot of articles out in terms of what how much it's costing, whereas something like the USA and Russia, incredibly inefficient, i.e. it costs them a lot to get that out. So that's in terms of volume. Now let's look in terms of quality. And again, you see that in terms of the quality of the UK, Canada, and Italy are really much stronger per dollar than some of these other countries. Now, why is that? Why can the UK these are the words the ambassador used. Why do we punch above our weight? Why are we able to have that volume and quality coming out of the UK? And there are other countries, as you see, who do that. How is that? And I would suggest there are many reasons, but perhaps two I would really land in your mind. The first is we empower academics and incentivize them to improve their quality. Secondly, which is very important, we actually measure and understand what is happening. So we actually are constantly reviewing and looking what changes in the system actually achieve. And to do that, one needs tools and all the other things. So in my mind, one can be efficient if one actually is in control of what one's doing. And that means a long-term analysis to achieve that. So, you of course also need skills to be able to do that. And we also need the academics to be effective, efficient, by ensuring they spend their time doing what they do. So why is it that the UK academics can be efficient and get a lot out of quality and quantity? Well, I would suggest, as my third point, that in fact it's because we take the burden of administration off academics. They would never say it's as much as it should be, but it's taken more off them, for example, in the UK, I suggest, than in the US, where academics surveyed in the US say they spend only 20% of their time doing academic work, 80% of their time is on administration and bureaucracy. So that, I would suggest, is an important thing. Okay, so how would Panama then begin to actually implement some of this in my mind? First of all, as I've said before, one must focus on quality and not quantity. Secondly, I would suggest one has to decide where one's investing in. For example, and it's, as I say, haven't dug into this data, maybe in some particular scientific areas, and I know those are, but investing is one thing, divesting is another. One has to recognize the cake is only so big, and actually you have to do the painful thing, which is closing departments down. Imperial does it, Cambridge does it. We don't continue just because we've always had nanotechnology institute, we always keep having it. They have finite lives and they have to survive, and based on their success. So what are your unique assets? Well, you know them. You're geographically strong, you've got a good environment, you have some very strong scientific assets, as Dr. Hubis has said times. You have good relationships with your main neighbors, a strong currency, a stable environment, you're a commercial hub. These are all really strong things. You know, people find it quite hard to fly to this little island almost at the Arctic Circle that we are. You are in an absolutely central position. So how do you exploit those things? You have to use them to promote that movement, that mobility, to attract people. And so my suggestion would be, and as I say, this is not deeply thought out, but first of all, as I've said, and many times, that. Secondly, focused international collaboration. Yes, you do collaborate an awful lot, but is it too diffuse? Is it not very clear? So if I went around the medical faculty in Imperial and said, who in immunology, what countries, what institutes in the world should you be collaborating with? They will know. They won't be spreading around all over the place where they can. Key is that academia is a long-term game. The absolute core of this are not the top-down people who try and determine how you should deliver research. The core has to bubble up from the young academics. And unless the young academics are incentivized, encouraged in their mobility, we will not have a future in 10, 20 years' time. So the lifeblood of any university is not the faculty, is not the great guys at the top of the departments. They're there provided they actually encourage and enable the young. I've talked about promoting efficiency for academics, getting academics at the bench, not academics writing grant proposals, which is what I'd call grunt work and rather boring work. Obviously, you have to horizon scan and you actively recruit. And showcasing what you do is obvious. So, my final slide. The question is, how does one do it? And I would suggest that just as you need tools and equipment to do the science you're doing, you need tools to assess and to understand where you are, where you could invest, and what the result of that investment is. And I come back to what I said at the beginning. I find it fascinating that in many universities in the UK, probably not at Imperial and Cambridge and Oxford, but at many universities, that assessment is not done in a rigorous, evidence-based way, and there is waste as a result of it. So, as I gave you one example. At Imperial, we set up an institute. So if, for example, some form of biomechanics is terribly important and good with the surgeons and we want to invent it, we can create an institute. But it is only created for 5 years. After 5 years, it is completely reviewed and the de facto position is that it is shut down, unless it can justify its position alongside the other people competing to be institutes. You cannot have something which starts and goes on forever, because science is changing. So it's a tough life, and you have to actually assess and measure and monitor where you're investing and what you're doing. And then the tools to do the kind of analysis that I've just hinted at today need people who understand how to do it. There's a science in itself, I suggest, in actually understanding some of those diagrams that I've begun to give you. And at Imperial, I had an office of some 5 or 6 people whose whole time was spent doing that analysis at a university level, so we understood exactly where we were. There's no point in a rector saying, tell me how good I am in neurobiology or whatever. That's just a snapshot. I need to know not only how good are we today, but where we've come from and where we are going, and how we are going there compared to our competition. So I think it needs skilled users. And what we have to do, as I've said with those tools, is we have to measure ourselves, we have to benchmark ourselves with whomever we choose we should be. We then have to understand what our strengths and weaknesses and opportunities are. And that must be a part of informing how the strategy of the university, the institute goes. I've mentioned before, huge support and reward has to go into the young scientists. They have to be rewarded through all sorts of funding and rewards. Not, dare I say, just a thank you. It's much more than that. Their careers have to be enabled, because I guarantee that the scientists who leave the UK as young scientists and go to the States for 3 years, they always come back, and actually their home is back where they started. So they bring back what they went away to find. So what will happen is promoting that mobility of the young will do it. And obviously there are tools to identify collaborations, and there are tools to find funding streams. And of course, as I've said, it's important to showcase. So what I've said to you today is that I think there are ways to promote efficiency for academics through central support, so using tools which are there to do just that. And I would suggest that without that, certainly in my time of over 10 years at Imperial, it focused our strategy, it focused our efficiency, and we grew up those ranking tables as well as up the ref in most of our areas over that time. So I'd be very happy to answer questions now, and I've left on my slides some references to some of the things I've referred to. So thank you very much.
¿Alguna pregunta?
Yeah, thank you, John. Just a few comments, because one problem, I think, what you said is that you equate quality straightforwardly with citation analysis. And that is a bit of a flaw, I have to say, in the way you present it. And of course, the Research Excellence Framework, which you frequently refer to, and I chaired the UK government's biological sciences panel, did actually not use metrics to any major extent. It was a peer judgment of the quality of the papers. And there are some dangers, I think, in signposting that all that matters are the citations. And the reason that I mentioned this is another problem which we must not forget about, and which is actually now serious, and that is the problem of reproducibility. We cannot open an issue on Nature any week without seeing again much discussion about how to deal with that. And many people, including myself, are worried that the chasing of getting papers into high impact journals, because that, at least for a short term, will give more citations, is certainly not the whole of the reproducibility problem, but it may be part of it. And as we know, a very significant proportion of papers, also in the biomedical sciences field, are deemed to be non-reproducible, particularly by the pharmaceutical companies. And we need, as academics, also to think about that. So I'm still a little bit worried about sort of giving the message that chasing citations is what it is all about, because it may not be a durable strategy.
You're absolutely right, and I completely agree with you. And my defense, if I may say so, is I had half an hour. And I tried to say that this is just scratching the surface of what one needs to do. I've said to other people in the room sometimes this week, for me, assessing anything is not just one piece of data, one data point. Of course it isn't. And a field-weighted citation index, it is one part of a jigsaw. In order to assess the quality of what one is doing, one needs to get a picture which begins to chime, which begins to resonate, which begins to make sense. Field-weighted citation index may be one thing, and it may be useful in some areas and not in other fields. Peer review is good, and there will be other ways in which one assesses. So, for example, the institutes, when we review our institutes at Imperial, we would get, of course, an expert group. We would look at the papers, we could look at the metrics, and we would bring all that together to make a judgment. What I'm trying to suggest is that there is a role for, within a university, someone to be harnessing all that information to produce, so if you like, getting together all the pieces of the jigsaw and then presenting that to the pro-rectors or the rector or whatever and saying, now put that jigsaw together and tell us what it is, and then you will discover what it is showing you. So in one, I would never do anything based on one piece. You're absolutely right.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Thank you so much for your talk. I just wonder, in the jigsaw that you just described and the many different variables that you take into consideration to measure the quality or the outputs of scientists in the UK, what is the role of patenting and licensing in the whole scene?
I understand, and interestingly, if we go back, I think I've lost my presentation. There is a slide in my presentation which showed how the quality of the Research Excellence Framework is measured, and 60% of it comes through the submitted papers, Let me quickly go. So, the total quality and the way in which the money is measured is through three things. First of all, the outputs, the publications, then the impact, and then the environment. So the environment is essentially how good are your buildings, your equipment, and all the rest of it. So what's the quality of your environment? The impact is saying, okay, what has happened as a result of the research you've done? And that can be measured in all sorts of ways. It might be measured in terms of, well, the work I did led to the discovery of drug X. When impact was first brought in, and this is the first ref it's come into, when it was first brought in, everyone said, oh, well, this will be jolly easy for the medics, because they'll be able to show that they cured cancer, 10 years later or 20 years later. And the arts and humanities people sat there weeping because they thought, well, how can we describe impact and so on? And very interestingly, they started describing it far better than many of the scientists, because they were saying that our work began to have an impact on social policies, on government acts, on the way in which charities began to distribute their money, and so on and so forth. So the impact of our work on society is, yes, partly measured through patents, although, of course, a patent is nothing unless it's exploited. So it's partly measured by spin-off companies, but that's only one of many, many ways I suggest that impact can be measured. And I wouldn't want to home in again on just that one little jigsaw in there.
Hello. I have a question, like, how receptive are the people in the UK, like the general population or the non-scientific people, to believe in government to, like, give funding for research? And what are the strategies, like, to make people, like, believe in that? Because I believe, like, in Panama, something's like the government cannot come, like, with a proposal to, like, invest a lot in science, because the general population, the non-scientific population, wouldn't believe that is like a priority. What's the strategy, or what are, like, the difference that you could see besides the whole thing of development to people actually believe that, I mean, we can do science and that will improve people's lives? And yeah.
So a very important question. So how do we justify what we're doing and convince the whole of society that we are worth investing in? And unless we achieve that, we may as well go home. Because we're not here for our own self-satisfaction, to do our own experiments and our whatever for our own sake. We're doing it in order to better society in all sorts of ways. So we have to be able to take the population, the taxpayer of the country with us. That's absolutely critical. So how does that happen in the UK? It happens through a number of ways. Not all perfect, I might say. So we have a lot of work put into what we call the public understanding of science, where on our radio programs, on one of our most popular radio channels, 3 times a week at a popular time, there will be scientists talking about their work in a way in which one can understand it. And for example, when gravitational waves just 2 weeks ago were discovered, it was all over the newspapers in a way which at least the public could sense something important was happening. They couldn't judge what the impact, and I don't know what the impact, no one knows what we can do now we understand that Einstein was right in his general relativity and whatnot. But actually people know that it's significant, just like they knew discovering the Higgs boson was thing. So there is a big role for the media to play in trying to translate that. Then there are other ways which the UK government uses in order to get closer to the electorate. So we are at the moment just going into a phase of what's called science and innovation audits. What they're doing is looking at the strengths of our science in different parts of our country. So for example, in the Northwest, as I think was mentioned some other time, that's graphene was invented or discovered, in Manchester. And so one is looking at where one might begin to grow industries and around Manchester, because that's where the core. The Turing Institute is another example where we're looking at where we build on expertise in regions and bring hubs of industry around the universities. So around Cambridge, around Oxford are big science parks where startups come and so on. And somehow the region, so Cambridge feels like a region which is entrepreneurial and startup and so on. And what this government is now doing is saying it's not just in Cambridge, Oxford and London, it's going into other places because there are nuggets and you have to fertilize nuggets and make them grow and therefore have impact in the society around, both impact for labour and as well as other ways. Not an easy thing to do, but absolutely critical. And it comes back to the point I said. Why are we doing this? We're not doing it just to get another grant and do more of what we think is quite interesting and whatever. We're doing it for the betterment. So the vision for all of what you're doing, and I would love at the end of this conference to hear, 2 bullets as to what Panama's vision is. That is what carries the public. Just telling them we've discovered this or whatever is no good. You have to say, where is it going to take us?
Hi. Sorry, here. Left, right. I had a quick question. You mentioned importing faculty. Like in many countries like UK, Europe, scientists are forced to retire, and many of them go to the US. What would it be worth importing some senior faculty member, change completely science in a place like Panama?
So your question is, what should are you saying that maybe senior faculty should not retire or what?
No, importing senior faculty from other places to places like Panama.
Okay. I worry that, I'm probably going to be politically incorrect, but I'm going to the extreme example, which is Russia. And as we probably all know, that in Russia, research is driven top down. The academicians, who are the grand men of science, usually men, in their 70s or 80s, are still running the institutes and determining what the research should be. And little power and creativity is given to the young scientists to decide where to go and where to grow and where the fields are going. So my worry is that if the scientific strategies are top down and determined by people who were, yes, very good and whatever, but are not actually, they're not necessarily the right people to promote to promote creativity amongst the young. So Russia is the prime example where you saw in my graphs their outputs are low and poor quality, their research volume is low for the size of the country, and their efficiency is terrible. And I believe that's because it is a top-down strategy driven by people whose research was strong a long while ago. Having said that, of course, there are many people whose research careers, active research careers, keep going, and that's fine. That's fine. So that's the danger.
Thank you, Dr. Green, for your amazing talk.